So last week we were talking about this Bible and how tremendously important it was. It was like the TV show that never ends, that everybody watches, that goes on forever, that you have to watch. You can't not be involved with it if you're living in that period. And I want to talk about it in relation to the idea of suffering, which might seem a bit strange to you because in modern times, suffering is almost like a taboo. We don't talk about suffering very much. It's something, you think about when you see your friend on the Joe concourse and you say, hello, genki desu ka? And they're supposed to say, hi, genki desu yo. If they say, jitsu wa, and they've got some problem, we feel a little bit uncomfortable about that. Oh dear, It's not really kind of joshiki even to talk about, my grandmother just died, or, I've got terrible pain in my back, or anything really. We don't really talk very much about those things. People sort of say, oh, well, see the doctor, I hope it's going to be okay. But we don't really pay an awful lot of attention to the topic, and we feel perhaps even a little bit uncomfortable with it. So it was not the same in the early modern period. Suffering was really central to the way they looked at the world. So let's just get a little bit of background here. As I think you should remember by now, Martin Luther was the person who challenged the authority of the Catholic Church by putting forward his 95 Theses, where he believed the Church was not following the truth of the Bible. And those 95 Theses actually begin and end with the topic of suffering. Suffering is central to what he writes in his Theses. And these differences between what the Catholics were saying and what was in the Bible were really important to people at that time. They were so important that people would think it was important enough to die for it. So that's something else that we need to think about. They would be burned to death simply for disagreeing with something that the church said, and they felt it was worth it to suffer that much because it meant that they were going to go to heaven as far as they could see. So the Bible and what was written in the Bible was, as I said last week, the center of people's lives, the show that never stops. And central to what was going on in the Bible, why was the Bible so important to them, was because it was the place that they would look to answer one of the central questions in their lives: why do we suffer? You may think that suffering is just suffering because perhaps you've never really thought about it before, but suffering changes very much depending on how people think about it, how a society thinks about it. Okay, I mean, if somebody punches you, you feel bad about it. But if you're having a massage and it really hits the nerve, but you kind of, you don't. Your feeling about it is different because you feel that somehow it's doing you good. Okay, so you have a different relationship to it depending on how you think about it. All right. So this was something that was very important for people in those days, how they thought about suffering and whether it was doing them good or whether it was just punishing them, or what was the meaning of it? What was the point of it? So they asked the question, why do we suffer? And these days we may often feel that suffering doesn't have very much meaning. There's not much point. I go out into my garden and it's December, and I come back in and I've got this huge rash from some kemushi. Well, kemushi die, in the winter. This thing's been dead for several months. Okay, but even after it's dead, those little hairs still carry on, having their itchy kind of. What's the point? I mean, when it's alive, I can understand it's protecting itself. But it's even after it's dead. Why does it have to hurt me now? It's been dead for months. Is there really a meaning to that? Okay. From a modern point of view, a lot of suffering just seems like, well, that's a real shame that even has to happen. Why does it have to happen? What's the point? But from the biblical point of view and the way people looked at it in the early modern period, suffering was never something that had no meaning. It always had a purpose. There was some point to it. So what was the point? Well, the point would be, both in the Bible and in early modern times, either it was punishing the wicked or it was purifying the good. So suffering would either be a punishment for something bad, just like hell. Hell is a punishment for bad people, all right? Or it would be purifying people, so just like a massage, it hurts but it makes you feel better. It would be purifying people to make good people better. So let's take a look first at the idea of suffering as a punishment. More or less in our modern world, we do not consider it appropriate to, as I said, even to talk about suffering in public very much. We certainly don't go making people suffer. It's unusual that it happens. You're not going to walk out into the streets of Tokyo, for example, and see something like that. Okay, it's not going to happen. Okay. But this was typical in the early modern world. You would actually, in your everyday life, you would see these kinds of things, these terrible things, people being punished in public. All right? And you would grow up with that. There would be no real escape from that. That was part of life. The closest that we might come to something comparable might be something that's put on the television and we can just choose not to watch it. Okay, on the news about bombing in Syria or children starving in Ethiopia or something like that. But we can just choose not to watch. But this would be out there in the street. It would be part of what people grew up with, and of course, it could possibly happen to anyone. As we saw, being a princess didn't mean that you couldn't get your head cut off. All right, being a queen or being, it didn't matter how high or low you were in the society. There was no escape. It could happen to anyone. In the little village of Rottingdean, where my mother lived until quite recently, she died about this time last year, actually. And I used to when I was in England, I'd go to her, I'd do the shopping for her because she was 19 years old. She couldn't get around very easily. So I'd go and do the shopping, and I would have to walk past the street that was called Whipping Post Lane. Still there, the sign is still there, that's still the name of the street. Of course, there's no whipping post there now. But there used to be. And it would be something like this. This one's made of stone, although they could have been made of wood. This one is still standing in a village in Worcester. There are still a few of them left. Okay? And people would be tied. It would be what it sounds like. People would be tied to them and whipped. And here you've got something called the stocks, where it would open up, and they would have to put their legs through there, and then it would be locked up again. This has got enough for 3 people to be... yes, there's a print there. There would be enough for 3 people to be sat there, and they would have to just stay there, okay? And people could come and throw things at them. All right, this was a basic part of early modern life. This one is the pillory, which is a similar sort of thing, except it's made for the arms and the head. And this one is high up, and it's made for 2. Quite possibly it was specialised for people who committed some sexual impropriety together. Okay, a married man had slept with a woman, and they'd both be put up there, all right, to publicly humiliate them. Here is James Naylor, a Quaker. Now, this is the 17th century, but this would have been going on all through the period, 16th, 17th century, and it didn't really end formally until the 19th century. James Naylor, a Quaker. Again, it's a religious thing. Quakers are a very strong form of Protestant, and too much Protestant for the Church of England and for the government. So first they tie him to a wagon, and they pull the wagon through the streets, whipping him as the wagon goes along. Then they tie him here to a pillory, and they cut out his tongue. Right? This is the sort of thing that went on. Sorry, it's probably not exactly what you were hoping to come and find out about. First thing in the morning. It's a bit strong, isn't it? But this is the reality. Okay, this is what people would have to go through and experience and see it in their daily lives. And this is the beggars being whipped through the streets in the 1530s. You remember I said the monasteries were closed, and there was no safety net anymore for beggars. And here they are, just being homeless people being whipped through the streets. Our society maybe isn't very kind to beggars. You know, the benches that you used to be able to sit on when I was a kid, most of them have gone, or they've put something in the middle so you can't lie down on them these days. So our society is not all that kind of kind to beggars, but we don't whip them through the streets. Okay, so things were a lot more violent, basically, than today. And here is again, it's the 17th century engraving, but this was something that was going on all through the 16th and 17th centuries. These are women that were accused of being. Sorry. I should have closed my email program before we started the lesson. I forgot. This is women accused of being witches. All right. And witch hunts. We'll be looking at witch hunts later on in more detail. They were a big thing in those days. They really believed that people were witches, and they punished them. The idea is often thought that witches were burned, which is true in other parts of Europe. Witches were burned, but in England they were hanged like this. And so there are all these kinds of things going on in public in early modern England. Just take a look at some of the visuals here. All right, so you've got the pillory there, the stocks and the pillory. This is the stocks. This is the pillory, and people come along, and you hope they're just going to throw soft things like tomatoes and rotten eggs or something. But if you were unlucky, people might come and throw stones at you. You just didn't know. I suppose it would depend how angry people were with you for what you'd done. Okay, these were some of the things, and of course this burning was for religious reasons. This would be people who were burned for their religious beliefs. And it was obviously it was a punishment, but it was also clearly, for some people at least, it was a kind of entertainment. And if you couldn't get enough of it from watching human beings suffer, you could go and watch animals suffer. Queen Elizabeth was not cruel in the way that her father was, but nevertheless, it was one of her favourite forms of entertainment to go and watch bears being attacked by dogs. And people would bet how many dogs can the bear kill before the dogs kill the bear. All right, and that was fun for people in those days. They had other very nasty things that they did to cats and dogs and other animals, and you don't want to hear about it. Okay, it was entertainment. I'm not saying that everybody in those days would have enjoyed such entertainment, but it was popular. All right. Okay. On the one side, it's entertainment, but it's got a lot more aspects to it than just entertainment. Basically, it's reminding people of hell. It's like a little taste on this world of hell coming in the next world. What's going to happen after they die? There's this basic message that in the end, no one can escape God's judgment. And there was a kind of feeling that this must be right. It must be meant. It must be okay for all of this, because if it wasn't okay, God wouldn't let it happen. God has, absolute power. God has complete power. So if it was wrong, God wouldn't let it happen. Okay? It's part of Christian belief that God knows everything. All right, God is all powerful. God is all loving. He loves everything. And it's a rather, as we shall see, it's a kind of this loving. And how can God be loving if he allows these things to happen? It's a sort of paradox, and it's really what this student was asking about in her comment on the blog. If God is all powerful, all knowing, and all loving, why does he let all this stuff happen? How is it possible for God to be all loving and at the same time to say, you burn in hell forever? This is one of the big problems that Christianity has to try to work with. All right, because it's a paradox, isn't it? If God is all loving, why would some people be sent to hell to burn? So this would also affect the way that people experience their own suffering. And this is where we're going to have to remember that in our modern world, we have ways to escape suffering to a certain extent. I mean, I had a bit of a cold and a cough, so I took some medicine. Although we don't think much about that, but part of the medicine is that I don't feel the effects of the cold and the cough so much. Right? Go and have an operation. All right? You're not even conscious. But as we shall see, in early modern times, there was nothing like that. So they couldn't really escape from suffering. There was no medical escape from physical suffering, or very little compared to today. So what did their suffering mean? What was their suffering? How would they understand their suffering? Is it just a taste of what they're going to experience after death? Like, oh my God, if this hurts in this world, what will it be like, when God punishes me for eternity? What's it going to be like? How will I stand it? So compared with our world today, where we can avoid suffering in various ways, in those days, everybody would be liable to suffer. Everybody was going to get sick, everybody was going to die, and they weren't going to be able to avoid the pain associated with that. There were no anesthetics, there were no painkillers. Dental surgery was performed with nothing or very little to desensitize the pain. And if you needed an operation, your body would be cut open while you were fully conscious. Just thinking about that, all right? It was horrific. These are a set of early modern tools used by a doctor giving an operation. These were surgical tools. They would be used on people's bodies while they were completely conscious. Not to hurt them or to punish them, but to make them better. All right? Pretty kind of shocking, isn't it? So, because of this, because all this suffering was all around people while they were alive, and because they were also threatened, according to their religion, according to the Bible, with suffering forever in hell after they died, well, people naturally wanted to make some kind of sense of this. What is all this suffering? What's the point and the purpose of it? And as we said, for bad people, the meaning was clear. Suffering was a punishment. But it's not true that only bad people suffer, isn't it? Everybody suffers. So how do we understand the suffering of good people? As I say, their suffering was seen as a purification. And it was supposed to be God's way of preparing those who were chosen to go to heaven by purifying them in this world. So their suffering would be a way of cleaning out any impurities in them so that they would be fit to go to heaven. That was the idea. There's it's not an English painting, it's Hieronymus Bosch, a Dutch painter, very famous painting called the Garden of Earthly Delights. It was painted sometime around the end of the 15th century, the beginning of the 16th century, and it really shows very clearly the idea that, we pay for our pleasure. Having too much pleasure in this world will mean that you're going to pay for it after you die. So the Garden of Earthly Delights, if you experience delight in this world, when it comes to the next world, you will be paying a heavy price. Let's look at the details of this painting. It's what's called a triptych. That means it's in 3 parts. The left-hand part shows what is the painter's idea of the Garden of Eden, paradise. At the beginning of the Bible, Adam and Eve. But you notice that there are some very kind of violent things going on. Animals eating flesh here, some very uncomfortable sides to it. It's not just a pretty picture. And you've got Adam and Eve here with God. And in the foreground, again, you've got some very uncomfortable little things. Animals eating other animals and some very strange-looking creatures. It's not at all an ideal picture. And it's as if he's saying against the Bible. Because in the Bible says that animals eat grass and herbs in the beginning. And they only start to eat other animals later on. But God made a world where that kind of cruelty didn't happen. That kind of suffering didn't exist. And it's humans. It's humans who brought suffering into the world because they didn't obey God. And so, again, this is a problem for Christianity because, remember, in Christianity, God made everything. Everything. So where did suffering come from? Because not only did God make everything, but if you look at the beginning of the Bible, it said God made it and saw that it was good. Everything that God made, he saw that it was good. Okay, so where did suffering come from? How can we say suffering is good? Suffering comes from human weakness. That's the Christian idea. Okay, it's not God that made the suffering, it's our fault that there's suffering. Okay, and it's even our fault that the animals are cruel to each other. Okay, if you look at the way that the Bible explains, it's only after Adam and Eve eat the apple that the animals start to eat each other. Okay, so it's not very strongly described, but if you look at it carefully and closely, you'll see that at the beginning the animals all eat grass and plants, and then later on the animals are seen to be eating each other. So that's the picture at the beginning there, and the idea that it's humans who bring suffering into the world, not God. And then we've got the central part of the picture, the centre of the triptych, showing it's mostly sexual, showing people having sort of naked, wild, orgiastic, sexual kind of pleasure, and that's just sort of going all through kind of notice how everything is kind of going in circles and swirls of kind of activity there. Okay, just sort of slowly scroll through it. You can see all the different types of sexual activity and improbability of it, really, some of it. All right, but the basic idea there being that people are, this is the garden of earthly delights. They're just living their lives for pleasure in this world. And where does that lead them? How is that going to be paid for? Well, it's going to be paid for like this. All right, all kinds of nasty forms of cutting and humiliating and all kinds of nastiness and horribleness can be found. It's a nightmare picture of just suffering as Bosch imagines it after death. This sort of cycle, look, they've been brought up here, fed into this horrible thing, being spewed, coming out the other way, and then they go around in a sort of circle and they come back again, they have to do it all again and again and again. That kind of, again, the cycle of pleasure becomes a cycle of suffering. So it's a pretty horrific, gruesome, and for early modern people, very real thing. Having pleasure in this life means that you're probably not going to have pleasure in the next one. You're going to suffer in the next life. Which is, as we're going to see later on, that leads to a pretty, in some ways, a depressing view of life. Because if you're enjoying yourself, you think, oh, there must be something wrong. It means I'm going to go to hell later on. So it's a good example, I think, this painting of Bosch's. It's a good example of the economy of suffering, how suffering is paid for. We pay for our pleasures. Now this is something that it's not just a Catholic thing or a Protestant thing, it's a Christian thing. All right, you're going to find it among Catholics and among Protestants. And the other side of it is that not just that we get punished for our pleasures, but we can be rewarded for our suffering. There can be a reward for those people who suffer. And that's the other side of this economy of suffering. And again, both Protestants and Catholics went along with this. This is part of a broader Christian view. But the difference, the important difference in the early modern period is the way that they did it. All right, they both had the idea that you pay for your pleasures, you'll suffer later on, and you pay for your suffering, you can be rewarded later on. But their attitude towards how you would manage that economy of suffering and pleasure was different. All right, so we're going to move on and look at some of those differences, or the basic important difference. You see, for Catholics, there had been this system of penances. Penances were a system of purifying yourself through suffering. You could consciously enact these penances. You could take this little thing and you could hit yourself on the back with it, okay, and make your skin smart. Ouch! And that was you were taking a positive action to bring physical suffering onto yourself, and this was called penance. And it would be something that the priest would tell people to do. If they went to confession and they said, look, I did a very bad thing, I'm very sorry. Well, if you're really sorry, this is part of what you have to do to purify yourself. There would be various types of penance. Fasting would be going out without food was one of them. Hair shirts were uncomfortable forms of clothing. And whipping yourself, these were all forms of penance. And basically, where did this idea of penances come from? The Catholics had got it from the Latin translation of the Bible made in the late 4th and early 5th century by a man called St. Jerome. And this translation was the one that was used for 1,000 years or more up until the Reformation. This was the one basically used, the Latin Bible of St. Jerome. Okay, it's sometimes called the Vulgate. Okay, because it was translated into the vulgar languages, the common languages, which were which in those days, the common language in those days was Latin. Okay, so the common language throughout Europe, the was Latin, and the Vulgate was the Latin Bible of St. Jerome. So the other name of it is St. Jerome's Bible. Okay, and in it he uses the idea of penance, which is in Latin it's penitentia. Okay, and the verb is to do, agere, penitentia agere, to do penance. So penance was something that you did. Right, I think we talked a little bit about this before. Let's go into it in more detail and see why people believe that. Here is St. Jerome. He is a basic model for the Catholics at the time that we're talking about. He lived the life of a hermit, the ascetic life. In other words, ascetic is he didn't give himself any comfort, no comfort. Okay, he'd sleep on a stone. He would wear the minimum of clothes. He would make his body suffer as much as possible. And he was famous for all of these kinds of penances that he imposed on himself. And it's all part of that larger system that we talked about, justification by works. How are we justified to go to heaven? We're justified by works, like praying, by doing charity and things like that, and by actively suffering. Okay, so the system of penances is just part of that. Well, the Protestants were against all of this. They said, sorry everybody, but Jerome made a big mistake here. This is the wrong word. They went back to the Hebrew, the Greek, the original languages that the Bible was written in. Some of it was originally written in Latin, but most of it was written in Greek, Hebrew, and Old Aramaic, and even some other languages. But they went back to the original sources as much as possible, and they said, well, really, it should not be penitentia, penance. It should be repentance, which is something that you feel inside you. You don't. Okay, repentance is not something you do, repentance is something you feel. So it's something that you have to feel inside yourself. You have to feel sorry for what you did. Okay, so this was the Protestant view. It wasn't an action like fasting or whipping yourself, it was something that people felt in their hearts. And they were against, therefore, they were against these acts of penance. And they believed that people should suffer patiently and they should accept whatever God sent, but they shouldn't impose suffering on themselves. So their model in the Bible, a different model, it was Job. Okay, Job would be the typical example of the Protestant idea of suffering. Job did not make himself suffer. He wanted to enjoy his life. He wanted to be happy. But God boasted to the devil about Job. God said to the devil, look at my good servant. Look at Job. Look at how he worships me. Look at how he respects me and loves me. And the devil said, that's because he's rich. That's because he's got lots of cows and he's happily married and he's got all sorts of good things going for him. Do you think he'd love you so much if he was suffering badly? God said, I don't know. The devil said, hey, let's find out. So God says, okay, I give you permission. And the devil makes Job suffer. Covers his body with horrible boils and nasty things, makes him sick, gives him his wife nags him, his friends who are supposed to support him actually make him feel worse. Everything goes bad, his animals die, and Job still loves God. Okay, God says, yeah, I win, the devil loses, and you've got to stop now. And Job goes back and he gets happiness again in his life. So he doesn't choose to suffer. God chose him to suffer. And that's the Protestant idea of suffering. Okay? The Protestant idea was that you should accept the suffering that God sent, but you shouldn't try and purify yourself by making yourself suffer. And again, just as the Catholic idea of suffering was part of a bigger system called justification by works, the Protestant idea of suffering was part of a bigger system called justification by faith. People could go to heaven through their faith, their belief, their trust in God. And part of that is trusting that God will only make you suffer as much as you can accept. God won't make you suffer more than you can accept. All right? So that at the same time as making you suffer, God will give you the strength to deal with it. That's part of having faith, believing that God will be there for you. So another aspect of that system was the belief that God had already decided people's fate before they were born. Again, you had to trust. I believe that God has chosen me. And that whole system was called justification by faith. So I've gone into a lot more detail this week about the idea of justification by works and justification by faith, and how it was connected with suffering, and how important suffering was in people's lives. Okay, I'm going to take a little break there. We will carry on in a few minutes' time. Okay, but that's quite a lot to have to deal with at 9:15 on a Wednesday morning. So let's take a little break for a few minutes. Oh. Okay, sorry. Okay, yeah.